All right, welcome back to Faith in Question. Again, I'm your host, Rob. I've got Dylan here with me again today, and we're going to do another segment of the 6-month Christian versus the 6-month skeptic. If you didn't see our first episode, we'll make sure we leave a link below so that you can go and take a look at that one first. But basically, Dylan, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you've been a Christian a little over 6 months at this point,
Yeah,
right?
pretty much. Told the story a little bit on the last episode. I've been in the Bible, reading, studying, and I think it's for real. I think the Gospels are reliable. I think that if it's considered from a historical point, it's reliable. So
Mm-hmm.
I also think the case for the resurrection is reliable. So
Okay.
I guess we can
Yeah.
dive in.
No, that's great. We've got a lot to talk about there. I did a video a couple of weeks ago, which was on the Book of Mark, and so there's a number of
Yes.
different excerpts from that we can talk about here. Although I also did a short that I think got a little bit of attention, so I'll open this up by playing that short about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and then we can dive into the conversation really anywhere you want to pick it up. But let me start out with this. Let's get this going here. Looks like it is trying. Hold on. All right. Another thing Christians don't understand about their Bible is that the Gospels were not written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. All of the Gospels are anonymous, and scholars agree about this. Even your favorite scholar, Wes Huff, agrees on this point. They are anonymous Gospels, and the names were added later. Now, think about this for just a second. Who were Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? The followers of Jesus, these were regular people in that day. They spoke Aramaic, but the authors of the Gospels, these were educated people. They spoke Greek, and not just regular Greek, almost a poetic version of Greek. They were highly educated. These were not the disciples of Jesus, certainly not Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John who wrote these Gospels. And why does that matter? It matters because it draws into question, were these actually eyewitnesses of these events, or did they hear it from someone else and wrote it down later? Do you like hearing tidbits like this about the Bible? Make sure you're subscribed. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop it there. So that just, I think, helps to set up a little bit of my viewpoint. And I went through in the video in Mark and talked about a number of contradictions and errors that, I found as I've read and continue to study there. But I'm curious about your thoughts, where you want to start this conversation, and we can drive from there.
Okay, cool. So I think to start off, I just want to say that the oldest manuscripts that we have of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they all have their names attached to them. So we have not found an actual quote unquote anonymous version of these, but I think what they mean by anonymous is that they don't directly claim who they are in the text. So like they don't say like, oh, this is Mark, I'm writing this. So
what copies of manuscripts or I guess I'm trying to figure out what are we basing this on, that these Gospels, that these writings have a name attached to them?
So they all have their names attached. So like Luke was directly writing to somebody. He didn't just didn't just send this to, I think it was Theophilus.
Mm-hmm.
Or Theophilus.
Yeah,
he sent that to Theophilus, right? And he's not just going to send this random thing to Theophilus. He's going to have his name attached to it, right? So, but the oldest, like P66 or whatever their names are for the manuscripts, they all have their names attached to them. You can look it up on the internet. So.
Okay.
I don't know where from what I've seen, I don't know where this anonymous thing comes from, other than they don't directly mention, like, this is written by Peter, this is written by Mark, Luke.
Yeah.
Like,
I'll tell you this. I've been looking into this for a while. I have never seen an early manuscript from 1st or 2nd century of any of these Gospels that has a name attached to it. And look, there's a lot of scholarship on this issue. The majority of scholars agree that these are anonymous Gospels. The vast majority. Now that the majority doesn't make it right. Okay, like I'll be the first to say that. Just because it's the majority does not make it right. But there are a lot of people who have been looking into this for a very long time. I believe so. I mentioned that Wes Huff agrees with this statement. Wes Huff agrees with the statement that there are no names attached to the Gospels. However, he tries to provide evidence that point to the fact that the church tradition in as early as the first century has attached these letters to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Obviously, I dispute that, and most scholars do as well, but I think that's what you're thinking
think
of?
where that comes from is the original manuscripts did not, but the oldest ones that we have discovered, they do. And for example, right, so we know that Mark was the earliest written quote unquote gospel, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's not the earliest manuscript that we found from the New Testament. We've actually found first theologians, and that dates back to 35 AD. It's written by Paul, right? So in this letter, Paul actually talks about, and we all know the story of Paul, he talks about Jesus rising from the dead, and the oldest manuscript that we have. So we know that the Gospels were circulating before, right? So
I don't know that I'm going to draw that same conclusion as you. What I would concede is that yes, when the letters that Paul wrote were in circulation much closer to the time of Christ, within 10 to 15 years of his death, we see these letters start to emerge. And those letters, yes, they do point to Jesus as the path to God, right? Absolutely, that was Paul's belief.
The Gospels that we have. So that's what I found interesting when I was looking into this.
Yeah.
So if we have, let's say we have first theologians, right? I can go over
First
Thessalonians.
Thessalonians.
Yeah, Thessalonians.
Yeah.
See, new Christian here.
That's right. See, you're just proving it.
Yeah. But anyways, like if we look over to it, like it talks about I'm gonna scroll over to it. You could probably pull it up.
Yeah, let me go ahead and pull it up. Which chapter and verse are you looking at?
We have it's dated to around 30 to 35 A.D.
What chapter and verse are you on?
Testimony of John. I'm not. Let me look. 8.
Got 1 Thessalonians. Paul, Silvanus, and Timothy.
Yeah, so hope for the resurrection. I believe that is chapter 4. It's like the second section. So it talks about Jesus dying and coming back to life. So I think that's really important when we're looking at the reliability of the Gospels, especially since this dates back so early. This proves that there was at least an oral tradition going on that this happened, right? And every historian, even atheists, they agree that Jesus was a real person and that he was at least crucified. So if we can agree that he's a real person and he at least was crucified, now all we have to prove is that he rose from the dead, right?
Okay. So how do you prove that?
Yeah. So for example, that there could be a few theories going on, right? So either the body was stolen after he was crucified, they all hallucinated it, right? Or it's real. So if the body's stolen, that means they made it up, right? They don't really have anything to gain from making it up. Right? And then the way they go about it, the quote unquote Son of God, the Messiah, was killed in the most embarrassing way you could ever be killed. And then women come and spread the whole rumor, and then suddenly it has the biggest impact on the world of any religion. It spreads like wildfire.
Okay.
So it's just kind of suspicious, you know? I don't think the hallucination theory is likely. It just doesn't make sense. A bunch of people hallucinating, that never happens, right? Like group hallucinations. So I would say that this is kind of the case where we're at, you know?
Yeah. Okay. So I think there's two issues here. I want to deal with both, but we can probably do it separately, right? The first issue, it sounds like we're going to talk about Jesus's resurrection, right? And I think that's an important one for us to talk about. Separately from that, I think we should also talk about just the Gospels as a whole and their reliability, right? Because right now, I think you're talking about the Gospel as Paul lays it out, right? And that Jesus lived and that he was buried and that he was raised again the third day according to the Scriptures, right? So
all of Paul's letters kind of flow with the Gospels. So obviously he had some knowledge about it. So if it was fake, like, I don't know. I just don't see it being fake.
I don't dispute that they're talking about the same events, but Um, t- the fact that Paul wrote about this and the Gospels weren't going to be written until another 30 years after Paul was speaking about this. They hadn't been penned yet. That's, I mean, you can easily write down something later that works with the story, right? So that to me is not going to be much evidence. But let's talk about the resurrection. I'm not so convinced that Jesus was ever buried. And I'll tell you why. This is not my theory. I borrowed this from Bart Ehrman, who is a renowned Bible scholar, teaches at the University of North Carolina. And in his studies of the Romans and his studies of crucifixion, he can't find any instances, any evidence of anyone ever dying on a cross and then being buried. Why? Because you just mentioned this was a humiliating way to die, but after you died in this excruciating, agonizing pain, they would leave the body there as a deterrent. So birds would pick away at you and you'd be out there in the elements and literally the flesh would rot on the cross. And this was the end, humiliation not only in life, but also in death. And it was a deterrent to anyone else. See what happens when you mess with the Romans. So I'm not so certain that Jesus ever made it to a tomb. We have no precedent for someone making it
Jesus
to a tomb.
Wasn't just any ordinary person, though. Like, he had a massive following. He was constantly embarrassing the Pharisees and Sadducees. So to put him away in a tomb with a big stone, it's kind of case closed. Like, now it's over, you know?
So, like, well, like, first of all, I mean, I think the story, there's a lot of flaws in the story, and we can talk about those when we talk more about just the reliability of the scripture in general. But if you look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John's accounts, you're going to have a lot of issues when you look at those across the death of Jesus and the resurrection. So I already think that we have some interesting issues there. But to your point, okay, let's say that Jesus was allowed to be buried. What has never made sense to me is you've got this guy, Joseph of Arimathea, who decides to just give Jesus his tomb. Joseph of Arimathea was a Pharisee, right? He was among those that just delivered Jesus to Pontius Pilate and betrayed him as the king of the Jews so Pontius Pilate would condemn him to death, right? Why would he give him his tomb? Like, it doesn't even make any sense.
Was this Joseph of Arimathea? Was he the one that started believing in Christ as the resurrection was going on, or was that another person in the story?
There's a narrative of, I forget which gospel it is, but there's a narrative of him as he's walking down the road carrying the cross, right? Where Joseph is, again, like, this is, when I look at the story later on, I'm like, yeah, okay, you throw that detail in there just to try to make it make more sense, but it still doesn't, you know? But we can move on from that. He's in the tomb. Okay.
Yeah.
What is the evidence of the resurrection?
The evidence, it would be, so you have these 4 gospel accounts that are allegedly eyewitnesses. They have a very similar story, right? These gospels start floating around a bit sometime after Jesus' death.
Yeah.
Right? But then you have...
The stories are similar, but not the same. Would you agree with that?
They're consistent with what each eyewitness probably would see. Everybody's going to have a different story.
Let me give you some examples of what's not consistent, right? And some of this was in the video. Who went to the tomb after Jesus is gone from the tomb?
So one gospel says Mary.
Yeah.
And then the other one is 2 Marys.
Mary and Salome. You got a third person, right?
Yeah, but that's not necessarily a contradiction. That just, they left a couple people out of the story.
Okay, so let me give you more. In one gospel, they get to the tomb, and who meets them there? It's a man. Oh, okay, interesting. In another gospel, it's an angel. In another gospel, it's 2 angels that meet them at the tomb. Like, what do you do with that?
Yeah, the man, are you talking about when they're walking back and then the guy is asking about what happened and
Yeah, they're
Jesus?
saying that basically they're at the tomb, and this is actually in Mark's gospel. So in Mark's gospel, at the very end, chapter 16, it's like verse 6 or 7. Actually, we can just take a look at it real quick. So since I've got it up
Yeah.
here, let's go to Mark chapter 16. Perfect. I'm gonna go ahead and just share this again so we get it up on the screen. Perfect. Okay, so Mark chapter 16. All right. Okay, here we go. So, verse 5. And entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, dressed in a white robe, and they were alarmed. So, here in Mark 16, you have a young man who's there. It doesn't tell us anything else about him except for that it was a young man. But later on,
Hmm.
in other gospels, which were written after Mark, I believe Matthew and Luke both call this an angel, although one of those gospels says that there's two angels there, not just one.
Yeah.
So,
But
seems
also, this
problematic.
part is secondhand information. Mary is ultimately delivering the story to the 12. Jesus shows himself to the 12. So I don't necessarily see this as a contradiction. That could be
Okay.
an angel, and angels appear as men all the time throughout the gospel, throughout the Bible. So
Yeah, I don't dispute that they're talking about an angel here. I do think when they say young man, that's just the way that Mark said it. I believe that he's talking about the same angel that is spoken about elsewhere. But the point I'm making is there's a difference between one and two, and there's a difference
yeah,
between telling a story when you have Mary going to the tomb alone and when you have multiple women going to the tomb alone. There's a difference in terms of who she goes and tells next or what happens next. All of these things are different. The problem is this: when people read the Gospels, they read them in order or one at a time. So they read Matthew's account, then they read Luke's account, or Mark, then Luke, then John. But that's not how you're going to be able to truly see the differences in these stories. The differences in the stories present themselves when you say, let me look at the crucifixion and the resurrection, and let me bring up all four accounts, and you will see that I don't have enough fingers to show you the differences that are just either errors or really hard to explain between the story of the resurrection and crucifixion when we just look at the gospel side by side.
yeah. Well, I mean, it's like if me and you were in a bar and we saw a fight happen, we'd both have different stories of what happened. So I don't think this necessarily disproves the reliability of the
So then
gospel. I think what we have to look
let's
at is the manuscripts of what we have, and then we're not arguing if Jesus was alive and crucified. We know
yeah.
that's a fact. We have Tacitus wrote something about Jesus, so we know he's a real person. And scholars say that Jesus was probably crucified, right?
Okay.
So the resurrection's the issue. If
Yeah. Do you believe
so,
that the Bible is the inspired word of God?
yeah, of course, but it's
Okay.
still humans. Like they're this is their eyewitness account, so they have a lot of commonalities too. If you read them, you're like, man, this is like very close to what happens. They use different wordings, different phrasing. Each person has a different literary style.
Yeah. Yeah. But it's not the commonalities that matter, right? If I gave you two glasses of water, one was just regular water and one had 0.05% rat poison in it, that's going to be a problem, right? It's 99.95% water, but the 0.05%, that's a real problem for you. You're going to get really sick and you might die. It's the differences that matter, is the point that I'm making, right? And
Mhm.
trying to figure out, like, we're talking about reliability here. So
Yeah,
consistency is great, but is it reliable when you have two things that are different that can't be the same?
I don't know. I don't see it that way. I think if me and you both saw this and we wrote our versions of what happened, we're gonna have a little bit different story.
Mm-hmm.
You see what I'm saying?
So,
And then
so
also, that's like the same thing that the Quran kind of, oh, it's the inspired word of God, but it's also changed over time too. There's different versions of the Quran. It's translated from Arabic to English, right? So there's going to be minor differences in those different variants, but they're
yeah,
claiming it's the inspired word of God as well. So
yeah.
I don't think this is the issue. I think the issue is that is the resurrection, if it's
Well,
reliable or not. right?
Right. I mean, but it
And the
matters though.
contradictions, yeah, it does. There is contradictions, right?
Yeah.
You brought up Judas's death, and you can kind of make those stories fit, just like you can kind of make these stories fit, right?
Yeah.
So, like
It's
Judas fell
always,
headlong and burst open. If a rotting
yeah.
body is hanging and they cut it down and it falls, it's been there for a few days, it's going to burst open, you
That's
know?
true,
So,
but you wouldn't fall head first though, which I always find interesting because people when they try to put those stories together, they ignore the headlong part of it. I know that's
yeah.
not what
Well,
we're covering right now, but
yeah,
it's
there's actually an explanation for that I saw that
okay.
it's
You got to dip them
headlong has
upside down and then cut the rope so
no.
that
It has to go with the translation from the
okay.
Greek. That there's a common Greek word that uh, can mean something else. Like
Okay.
headlong was another phrase at the time. I'm not an expert in Greek
Yeah, that's
lexicon,
fine.
but
That's
so
fine. Look, let's why don't we switch gears, right? And let's just talk about the gospels more broadly, right?
okay,
Because
cool.
like it's going to be the case every time we do this, right? I don't think I'm going to convince you on many things, and you're not going to convince me on many things, right? But it's good to get both viewpoints out there, and I don't want to belabor the point. But we've talked about Jesus, we've talked about the resurrection. Let me ask you this, because when I think about the Gospels and the reliability of the Gospels, a lot of people point out to me and say, well, look, these people, if it was indeed Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which I'll concede for the point of this discussion so we can have a real discussion, let's say it was Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So Mark was penned in like 70 AD. Matthew and Luke were a little bit later, between 85 and 90 AD, and then you've got John 95 to 100, right? So we're within what could be the lifetimes of these people to be able to pen that. But they may have been eyewitnesses of the events that surrounded Jesus's life. But what about the birth? What about the nativity story? They certainly weren't there.
Yeah. Well, Luke in his gospel, he says, "Don't take my word for it. These are the words of the people that I have interviewed." And if that's the word on the street that he was born of a virgin, and they're all writing it down, Jesus is probably pretty open about that, you know? Mary, his mother, probably pretty open about that. Also, it does predict itself in the Old Testament. I believe there's a verse in Daniel that talks about the Messiah coming of a virgin, right? So also the whole coming of Jesus is predicted in the Old Testament, but that's a little different story.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't see why they would feel the need to make that up, you know?
Well, look, I mean, there's a theory around the Gospels where these would have all been people, whoever was writing this, right? They knew the Old Testament. That's very clear. They go back and point to the Old
Mm-hmm.
Testament over and over again. If you wanted to present Jesus as this person, this Messiah that they were waiting for, then this is what you would write about him. You would go fulfill all the prophecies. You would say, oh, and he did this, and he did this, and he did this. Now, we're talking about this way after the fact. What's so interesting to me about the virgin birth is that Mark, we all agree, is the first gospel written, and he doesn't mention the virgin birth. He doesn't mention the birth of Jesus Christ at all. And it seems to be a pretty important factor for Christianity that this Messiah would be born of a virgin if that's how you interpret the Old Testament. But Mark doesn't feel the need to mention that. I find that very interesting. Very interesting. But then when
Yeah.
Matthew and Luke are written, after Mark's been circulating for about 10 or 15 years, all of a sudden now it's important to go ahead and put in, oh, by the way, he was born of a virgin, and this was to fulfill this prophecy. So that it doesn't scream reliability to me when you have tenets of the faith that don't get included in the gospel.
Yeah. Well, Mark was pretty much jumped in head first, too. He started with John the Baptist, I believe, and just he was telling the story from trying to portray that Jesus was a Messiah. He was healing people and that he was going to rise from the dead. And I think the case, I don't think the virgin birth mix up here that you're talking about is like a big deal if all the other things point to the resurrection. Like a
Mm-hmm.
virgin birth is kind of like if God can rise somebody from the dead, you know, then being born of a virgin is not really a big deal.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I see what you're saying. I mean, it's missing. It's not in that gospel, but it is in
Yeah.
the other three. So
So, okay, what if I ask you, I mentioned in my video one of the biggest contradictions in the Bible that I'm aware of that really doesn't have a good excuse, which is in the book of Mark, right? Where Jesus tells the story of when David was running from Saul and he found solace or refuge with the high priest and ate showbread, right? Jesus recounts that story in Mark, but he misstates who the high priest was at that time. He says in the days of Abiathar the high priest, and we can go back to Samuel, 1 Samuel chapter 21, and find out that Abiathar was not the high priest at that time. It was his father who was the high priest, Ahimelech. So
Mm.
this was one of the really serious ones that just cracked my faith, because when I was studying this in Bible college, I heard the explanations people gave, and I said, that is not satisfactory. It says in the days of Abiathar, the high priest. It qualifies him as the high priest, and it wasn't. So either Mark messed it up or Jesus messed it up, but it seems to be a clear error. What do you do with
Mm.
those?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not aware of that one. I didn't see that one, so I mean, I guess I can grant that one too because I have no idea. But
Yeah.
so,
Yeah. I mean, look, there's people who make the argument that, oh, well, it's in the days of Abiathar, so it that could just be a general term for the timeline around when he would have been high priest because he worked so closely with David. But there's just places in the Bible where it says in the days of Noah, right? As it was in the days of Noah, so will it be when the Son of Man returns. Or likewise as it was in the days of Lot, they were eating and drinking, right? Like every time it says in the days of, it's talking about a specific event at a specific time. But
mhm.
that one doesn't seem to line up. So, okay, then the last thing, then maybe I'll ask you about your feedback on is I spent time talking about, and actually we were just looking at it, so I'll share my screen again because you were talking about manuscripts early on, and I'm not sure if you've seen this. If you haven't, tell me, and we can move on from it. But like in the ESV, we're in Mark 16.
Mhm.
If we go down to verse 8, right? They leave the tomb trembling, and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. And then you get this phrase right here. Some of the early manuscripts do not include chapter 16, 9 through 20. So basically, we have these two codexes that we work off of, Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus, which
Mhm.
are the oldest manuscripts of the entire book that we work off of today. And they don't have the rest of this book. And again, we agree that Mark is the first gospel written. So then Jesus appearing to Mary Magdalene, appearing to his disciples, the Great Commission, that's a pretty important part of the Bible, right? And all of this is not in the oldest text. We find it 300 to 400 years later that they started including this in the text. I'm not sure if this is one you've looked at, but this is another one that really gave me pause on this is an addition. Someone put this in later because they felt like it needed it. And we have proof of that.
Yeah, I don't really know much about this one. I think I did see something on this. I'm not sure if it's the manuscript doesn't contain it because it's damaged, or if it could be an addition. I'm not sure. So
Yeah. No, it's literally the end of the letter.
yeah.
At that point. That was the original ending. I'm going to do a video pretty soon that just covers this is called an interpolation, right? It's just an addition to the text later on, and we have proof that it was added later. I'm going to do a video about the top 10 interpolations in the Bible that I found, and we can come back to this one and certainly get your feedback on it as
Okay,
well.
cool. Yeah, I'll have to
So
look into that. There's so much information with the Bible. You can only do so much in like the time you have. But
yeah,
I've only been
no,
studying this for so long.
it's
But yeah,
a
I'll definitely look into that one.
it's a
I know there's one
massive
in
book.
John also. So like
No,
there's a couple in John that they're
mhm.
debating if it was added. Like I think the last book of John, their last
Yeah,
chapter of John.
I don't know the specific one you're talking about because there's a few that are in the Gospels. But most scholars agree that scribes have touched these up over time, and I think it leads to the broader feeling that I have when we go back to what's the reliability of the Gospels. I just like to remind people we're working with a text that is literally 2,000 years old, right? There are a lot of people, a lot of Christians who accept the fact that there's going to be some errors. There's going to be some contradictions. I was raised in a sect of Christianity that believed that there were no errors, no contradictions. Everything in this book is exactly the way it's supposed to be. As a matter of fact, even the translation into English is perfect and inspired by God, which I don't know where they get that from, but I'm sure you've seen that here and there as you've been around Christian circles. So the hardest thing for me is when I see all these errors, when I see these contradictions, when I see these interpolations, I can't look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and say this is in any way reliable. Even the historicity of it to tell the story. Yes, I think we all agree Jesus existed. Yes, I think we all agree that he died on the cross. But outside of that, it seems like anyone's best guess in terms of what actually happened during this time, because the Gospels can't even agree with themselves. But again, I want to give you the last word on this since you've been so gracious to join me on this. So whatever your thoughts are on the gospel, we'll let you wrap it up.
Yeah, I just think that the earlier dating of the letters, I think it's pretty convincing that these people at least believe that Jesus rose from the dead. Now, why that is, I think it's because he probably did. I don't see why they would make it up, you know? And then they give it the worst story possible for people to believe, oh, this is the Messiah. And then these women, like, right? So there's texts and like Roman texts that show that people did not ever believe women's like testimonies because they gossip and stuff like that. Like there's multiple texts you can look at, and women saw Jesus rise from the dead, and then he showed himself to Peter and then the other 12 and stuff like that. And in 1 Corinthians, you have the creed that it shows, so that he rose from the dead. And that all dates before the Gospels. So if Paul's running around preaching this word, at least he believes that. You know, so I think it's pretty. And then the more I look into it, the more I find. Like, I haven't been looking into this long, but I think the evidence is pretty convincing, if you ask me.
Yeah, look, I love it. We're going to leave it there. I have a few more points I would love to share, but I promised you the last word, and so we're going to leave it there. Dylan, again, thanks for doing this. We're going to have another conversation coming up where we talk about just a lot more things about the Bible, less about a specific topic and just wherever the conversation leads us. So we're going to do that. But for those of you who've been watching for this long, you need to make sure you've at least liked this video. You should be subscribed to this channel by now if you're not, because we're going to continue conversations like these. And hey, look, I don't claim to have all the answers. Let's learn together. Let's discover what we can about the Bible as we all search for what actually is true. So with that, that's another episode of Faith in Question. We've enjoyed being here with you. Dylan, thanks for being here, and we'll see you next time.